My name is Jim Cullafello, and I'm the Vice Dean of Academic and Student Affairs at the Ira Fulton Schools of Engineering at Arizona State University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our National Academy of Engineering Grand Challenges for Engineering Speaker Series, hosted by ASU and sponsored by the Kern Entrepreneurial Engineering Network. This engaging speaker series will focus on the 14 Grand Challenges for Engineering in the 21st Century. Esteemed speakers from across the nation will be sharing their expertise on these grand challenges and answering your questions. We are proud to be a part of the NAE Grand Challenge Scholars Program, preparing graduates to address these challenges. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Ramakrishna, the Director of the National Academy of Engineering Grand Challenge Scholars Program Network, to share his welcome.
Hello, my name is Ramakrishna and I am the Director of the National Academy of Engineering's Grand Challenges Scholars Program Network. The NAE Grand Challenges for Engineering, identified in 2008 by a committee of the National Academy of Engineering, are 14 critical global challenges for engineering in the 21st century, united by the mission of continuing life on the planet and making the world more sustainable, more healthy, more secure, and more joyful. The Grand Challenges Scholars Program, inspired by the NAE Grand Challenges, reflect the rapidly evolving nature of engineering education. The goal of the program is to prepare engineers who not only have the necessary technical skills, but also the cross-disciplinary knowledge, entrepreneurial spirit, the global multicultural perspective, and a sense of societal mission needed to meet the global grand challenges facing humankind in the 21st century. As of November 2018, 65 institutions across the US and around the world have implemented this innovative educational program, and nearly 100 are getting ready to join the consortium of GCSP schools. We at the National Academy of Engineering are thrilled that Arizona State University has taken the initiative to organize this series of presentations that will highlight each of the 14 NAE Grand Challenges and provide this valuable resource not only to its own students and faculty, but to students and faculty from around the world. On behalf of NAE, I would like to thank ASU and the Kern Foundation for making the presentation series possible. I'm eagerly looking forward to following how this series impacts and inspires the next generation to create solutions to our society's most daunting problems. Our best wishes for a successful series, and thank you very much.
Welcome. My name is Ram Pendiala. I'm a professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment here at Arizona State University, and I'm also the director of the school. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's NAE Grand Challenge speaker, Professor Daniel Sperling. For those of you who are tuning in and those who are present, we will have Professor Sperling's presentation, followed by a moderated question-answer session. You can send in your questions to text or via the YouTube channel if you're tuned in. So again, welcome. And today's presentation is going to talk about the future of transportation. All of us move and go places and try to access goods and services. And so transportation is vital to our life. And Professor Sperling is going to talk about the future of transportation, the revolutions that we are seeing in this space. And he is the most appropriate person to talk about this because he has spent a lifetime and an amazing career on this topic of great importance to the sustainability of our societies. So Professor Daniel Sperling is a distinguished professor of civil engineering and environmental science and policy at the University of California at Davis. He is the founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California at Davis, The institute was founded in 1991, and it is now one of the most recognized and reputed think tanks for transportation in the world. Professor Daniel Sperling has the transportation seat on the California Air Resources Board, and this is especially cool because he was nominated to that seat by the governor himself, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, in 2007. He has served as the chair of the Transportation Research Board Executive Committee. He has won the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Environmental Sciences. It is called the Blue Planet Prize from the Asahi Glass Foundation. And he's been twice the lead author for the IPCC, sharing the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He has testified 8 times to the US Congress, authored over 250 technical papers, 13 books, and one of his latest books is essentially the topic of today's presentation. He is widely cited. He authors articles for Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, and on and on and on. What's truly amazing, and one of his greatest kind of cool things, is in 2009, he was on the Jon Stewart show, which is quite interesting to watch if you get a chance to see that. On a more personal note, Professor Dan Sperling is a guru to many of us. And so I was a student, and Dan Sperling was my professor in 2 courses and served on my PhD committee. I have greatly benefited from his wisdom for many, many years. He continues to serve as a mentor to many of us who have had the benefit and pleasure of interacting with him and learning from him. So it gives me no greater pleasure than to welcome Professor Dan Sperling.
Well, Ram was very generous in his introduction, but I do have many, many great memories when Ram was a graduate student a few years ago. So I am going to talk about this topic of the changes happening in transportation. So actually I have a slide here just to tell you about this institute that Ram was speaking about that we have at UC Davis that I did found many years ago. And it is, I think what's unique about it, and it's what I've been committed to personally, is taking all that research, all that capability we have in the university, leveraging it and bringing it to policy, bringing science to policy. And it's a lot easier to said than done. But that's what we in the Institute are committed to. And by the way, any of you are undergraduates, I don't want to steal you away from ASU for graduate school, because it's a great school here. But if you're looking for something different, we have great programs for graduate students and for both engineers and non-engineers. So let me start out by saying that we talk about these grand challenges, we talk about these great inventions of the engineering inventions and accomplishments over the last 100, 200 years. But when we look at transportation, which is a huge part of our society, our economy, and of our personal lives, it really has changed so little in over half a century. In many ways, what we the transportation community, have really failed. Because if you look at it, what's happened? Traffic congestion is worse, greenhouse gases emitted is worse, safety has not been improving for many years, and in some ways has gotten worse as well. And transit is actually losing ridership across the country. So what is it, this is the state that we're addressing, the state of transportation. So if we look back a little bit, what are the big transformational changes or innovations that have happened in transportation. And I have it listed both for passenger travel and freight travel. And on the passenger travel, you can see, for both of them, you can see the last ones were 60 years ago, over 60 years ago. And actually, I was looking just this morning at the great inventions that the National Academy of Engineering has identified over the last 150 years. What were they? Number 2 were cars. Number 3 were planes. Number 10 or 11 were interstate highways. And number 16 or 17 was oil. You know, all of those are transportation. And all of those were transformational. But what's happened in the last 60 years? Almost nothing in terms of major innovations. Yes, our cars are more comfortable and drive a little more smoothly, and the cars themselves are safer. But in terms of the bigger picture, cars haven't changed. 4 wheels, they drive about the same speed, they carry the same number of people. They're really functionally the same that they've been for many, many decades. So looking forward, I've kind of been a little more precise. What are some of these downsides or negatives about transportation, and what can we do about them? So one is cost. The average cost of owning and operating a vehicle over about the first 5 or 6 years of the life of the vehicle is over $8,000. You know, that's when you take into account insurance, the depreciation of the vehicle, the fuel costs, and so on. And even when they get older, they're not much less expensive than that because you start spending a lot of money on repairs and maintenance. So one of the themes that I'm going to communicate to you here is we need to increase choice so that we're not dependent on those expensive cars to provide all of our mobility and accessibility. So you're going to hear more about that idea. Environment. So as I said, the amount of greenhouse gases is increasing, the amount of vehicle use is increasing, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In some ways it's a good thing, but it's leading to more problems with pollution and environment. So some solutions to that I'll be talking about also is we can convert our cars from being gasoline to being electric cars, much less polluting. We can start using for short trips these what we call micro-mobility, those scooters and bikes that you see around. And pooling, and that's the idea. We just use all of our vehicles more intensively, our cars, our buses. How do we use them more intensively so we don't have to have so many vehicles running around there causing all this cost and congestion? And then there's transit. And over the last, almost 10 years now, we've been seeing transit ridership across the country, almost everywhere in this country, going down. And this is at a time when we have more money, we have more congestion, and yet we still have decreasing transit use. And so the solution in that case, or there's several, but the major one that I'm going to emphasize is that we can't depend on our traditional transit services, our fixed route, fixed guideway services. It doesn't work well in the land use patterns we have here in the US. Not in Tempe, not in Arizona, not in California, almost nowhere, except maybe Manhattan and a few dense cities. So what we need to do is connect them better with these new kinds of innovations, and I'm going to talk about that. And then safety and security, and we're seeing, fatalities had been going down for a long time. They've leveled off in recent years and actually been increasing for pedestrians. And again, this is for the US. So again, another premise that I argue for is we need more protected infrastructure for people that are bicycling and using scooters so that it's safe. We need, and we can use a shift to automated vehicles because those are going to be much safer than what we have now. All right, so put all these ideas together, and it's what I call the three revolutions, the three transportation revolutions. And those are electrification, electric vehicles. And by the way, when I say electric vehicles, I mean not only with batteries, but also using hydrogen and fuel cells because they use electric motors as well. Okay, so it's electrification, it's automation, automating all of our vehicles, and it's sharing and pooling. And by that I mean having more, as I said earlier, more vehicles, more people in the vehicles, including the cars. So if we look forward to what's going to happen in transportation. So like what I said is we've had almost no change for half a century. And now we've got all of these changes starting to happen. We've got the automation, which is just barely coming in, but will be taking off at some point. We've got the electrification starting to happen in a major way. And we've got all these ride-sharing services, Uber, Lyft, Via, and others that are coming into existence. So how is this going to play out? The point I'm going to make is it could play out in a way that is much better. In fact, I'm arguing that right now we have the best opportunity ever to create truly sustainable transportation, certainly in the last 100 years. This is our opportunity right now. But there's also another path where this could become, our transportation world could become even more of a nightmare. You know, for some people it is a nightmare now, and it can get a lot worse. So the heaven scenario, where we bring all these revolutions together in a really good way, going to result in cars that are all electric. We're going to end up with an energy mix. You know, the electricity is made from clean energy, renewable energy. We're going to have more capacity for mobility and accessibility. We're going to have better livability in our cities because it'll be more peaceful and not so crazy with all these vehicles, and it's so hard to get around, to get places. Better integration with public transportation and these private mobility services. And all these vehicles, these automated vehicles, are going to be well connected. But that's the heaven scenario. The hell scenario is one in which we end up with everyone having these automated cars, but they're individually owned. They just basically replace the cars we have now. And we end up driving them much more than we do now for the simple reason if your car is automated, that means you can sit in that car and you can do anything you want. You can treat it as a bedroom. You can treat it as an office. You can treat it as an entertainment complex. You can have your fingernails, your nail salon. It can be your own nail salon in that vehicle. Okay, so it can result in much more vehicle use, much more energy use, much more clutter. All right, so you can even add like the last item there. And it would be less equitable because you'd have rich people having all their fancy automated cars, and there'll be less commitment to mass transit and public transportation. And so you create a really serious equity problem, people that don't have access to these cars. And then you have these ghost, as it says here, ghost vehicles, zombie cars, because they're automated. So I come here, and oh man, parking's so expensive here. I'm not going to pay for parking. I'm going to just send that car back out into, I don't know where, Chandler, wherever I might live, where parking is free. and let it just wander around a while or sit there and then come back and get me. It's going to be all that's all zombie miles, zero occupant miles. All right, so to go through these quickly. Electric vehicles are going to dominate. There's absolutely no question about that. The transition is already happening. It's faster in some places than the others. The car industry is completely committed to electrification. That's where all their money, most of their research money is going now. And so we are going to see it. We have the United States is lagging a little bit. Europe is now moving very forward aggressively. China is also. California is, but most of the rest of the country is moving more slowly. And we have the policies in place in all those places to accelerate it. So there's a public commitment in most places, in many places, and also industry commitment. We're also going to see automated vehicles dominate. Many people call them autonomous vehicles. I call them automated because they're not autonomous. They're connected up with other vehicles. They're connected up with the infrastructure. And so, that's kind of an abomination of the English language to call them autonomous. I know it's a losing battle, but anyway, if you read my book, it says automated. But the question is, how will these automated vehicles be used? So as I described earlier, if these automated vehicles really simply are plopped down into the existing patterns of vehicle ownership and use, in other words, just replace our manually driven vehicles, then, as I indicated earlier, they're going to be used much more. There'll be much more vehicle miles traveled and all of the negatives associated with that. And so the question becomes, can we move it from that hell scenario into that heaven scenario? And the challenge is going to be great because we have conditioned people in this country to own your own car. And what I'm talking about is moving to a future where you don't own your car, where what you do is, just like with Uber or Lyft, you hit a button, a vehicle shows up, and it takes you to where you're going and actually picks up other people along the way. And there's so many people using it that it barely has to go out of its way very much because you have a lot of density of usage. And now you don't need so many vehicles. You don't need as much parking. You're not using so much energy. You don't even need as much road space. And because they're automated, eventually you can even make the lanes narrower because they're safer, and it's going to be very safe. So and they're electric, but that's almost like inevitable anyway. But that is part of this future scenario. So this is just a little research from my colleagues at UC Davis and UC Berkeley, where they actually did this research project that you would probably all want to participate in. They gave people that owned a car a chauffeur, human chauffeur, for I think it was 2 weeks to observe how they changed their travel behavior when they had someone that could drive them, because then now you can sit in the vehicle, you can do anything you want, and so what happened? And so these are just for different groups of people. So what you see is actually the group that increased proportionally the most were retired people, older people. When we get old, we get a little decrepit, we can't see so well, especially at night. And so the reality is a lot of older people do travel much less. They have much less mobility, and they stay home just because they're afraid of driving, and there aren't any good alternatives for most people. But overall, there was an increase of 83% in vehicle use. And these were vehicles that were just normal vehicles. Now, if you redesign these vehicles, which is going to happen, to be more suited to be an office, to be more suited to be an entertainment complex, or a hotel room, that's going to go way up, that number. That's probably a minimum, a low scenario. All right, so You know, and then there's the equity issue. So I'm not going to get into it much. I just have this one slide, and I want to emphasize it. Today's transportation system does a horrible job of serving the disadvantaged people. And disadvantaged, whether you have a physical disability or economically, you don't get good service. So here's a statistic that you almost never hear, but is an accurate one. The percentage of travel in the US that is by bus or rail is, if I was in a class, I would ask you to vote on it, but is 1%. 1% of passenger travel in the United States is by public transportation. It's 2% if you say do it by trips, and it's higher if you do it for cities. But overall, for the US, it's 1%. Now, if you just think about how many poor people there are, how many people with disabilities there are, it's way more than 1%. How are those people being served? You know, not by public transportation, most of them. And so they don't have good options, and they don't have good accessibility, they don't have good mobility. And here, just one little statistic is, it's so bad that you think about taxis. Taxis are really one of the most expensive ways of getting around. Probably is the most expensive way, other than paying for a really your own chauffeured town car. 41% of taxi trips in the US are by households with less than $25,000 income, because they don't have a good alternative. All right, so to cut to the chase, pooling is the answer. So that's actually the title of my last chapter in the book. And I've been spending a lot of time talking to mayors and city councils and actually doing a lot more research on it. I have a whole big research team of people. We have a whole research center devoted to this question of how to get more pooling, how to convert the automation and these sharing into a more sustainable future. So the idea is, again, as I described pooling earlier, if the problem is traffic congestion, pooling is the best answer we have. If climate change is a problem, then pooling is a big part of the solution. If social equity is a problem, like I just described, pooling also, because what happens with pooling, I'm going to have another slide, but I'll emphasize it here before you see it, the numbers, is that if we have an automated car that's pooled and electric, it's going to be really cheap. It's going to be cheap because, one, this car is being intensively used. You know, an average car in the US, it sits 95% of the time empty. It's used an hour a day. It sits empty. That is really poor utilization of our capital equipment. Okay, so now you're spreading the costs out over 12 hours or 15 hours a day of usage. You're also getting more than one person in there. So now you're dividing the cost by 3. And if it's electric, as electric vehicle costs come down, the cost of the vehicle might be a little bit more, but the energy cost is much less, the maintenance is much less, and it lasts longer. So you save a lot of money in that way too. So that's why this is a scenario that's actually much cheaper for travelers. All right, so, okay, that's kind of the happy story, the joyful story to one of the NAE challenges we just heard, that we want to be joyful, right? But this is going to be disruptive for a lot of industries, disruptive for a lot of people. So if you just look at the first disruption, were taxis. Taxis, in 8 years, they lost half of all their riders in the US. Almost every taxi company in the US is either bankrupt or in serious financial trouble, mostly because of Uber and Lyft. So they are going to be disruptive, and that's just the beginning. There's going to be, with transit, I already told you, transit has lost, almost every transit system is losing ridership. The so-called TNCs, the ride-hailing companies, are not the full explanation for it, but they're a part of the explanation for it. But it's going to be disruptive for car companies. It's going to be disruptive for the rental car industry. It already is, because they get most of their rentals at airports, and people now, you go to the airport and you take Uber or Lyft more likely than instead of renting a car frequently. It's disruptive for the airports because they got a lot of their money from the rental cars and from the parking. So it just spreads through all these different industries: insurance, parking, repair, the oil industry, of course. So kind of to wrap this up, thinking about the future, we have a challenge here. When you have big disruptive changes, transformational, they don't happen easily. And so, as I said, I spend a lot of time talking, not only talking to my researchers, but talking to policymakers. And if I go to a mayor, from what I heard, even in Tempe, maybe, and I say, scooters, what image do they get? They get disruption, safety, clutter, danger. If I say Uber, they say traffic congestion, pollution. Okay, that's a really negative way of looking at it. There's certain truths to it, of course, but instead we need to be thinking more strategically, thinking forward, thinking how can we take these innovations, these new technologies, these new business models, and how can we direct them toward the public interest? Instead of just saying, oh my God, those darn scooters, they're crashing into pedestrians and they're creating clutter on the sidewalk. Think about how can the scooters be part of the solution, and they are, because remember I said choice? We need to give people more choice. And so I'm an advocate of anything that provides choice beyond the single occupant car. I acknowledge all of the challenges, but the first inclination is think, I rest my case. Those of you online, that was a really noisy motorcycle. Okay, so we have to be thinking and acting more strategically. And that's relevant to researchers. It's easy as a researcher, you just look back and you analyze the data. But as researchers, we can be thinking about what are these issues and how can they play out in different ways, and what are the impacts and benefits and costs? What are the behavioral issues? How do people make choices? Under what conditions would they use a scooter? And I'd say, I love scooters, and okay, I know the first generation scooters really were a little dangerous. They had these tiny little wheels, and most cities didn't have a safe place to ride them, so you go up on the sidewalk, and then there's people there's big cracks, and of course a lot of scooter riders, have a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other hand. So it's not just the technology, but even here I saw some of the scooters have the Razor scooters. They have bigger wheels, they have seats. So these scooters are evolving in a way that'll be much safer in the future. All right, so looking forward, what are some of these strategies? These are the take-home points I want to make. We need more mobility choices beyond just our single occupant car. We need better linkages between our transit systems and these new types of mobility services. They need to be working together. They need to figure out how do we serve a lot more people in an efficient and safe and secure way. And we need more, to make all this happen, we need to create incentives for people to use these other modes of travel, and disincentives for the single occupant vehicle. And I know in some places that's political heresy, probably in many parts of Arizona, but many other places as well, even in California, in many places in California. But this has to be the future. We can't just be building more roads and depending on our cars. It just doesn't work. And so there's a lot of ideas, a lot of research, and a lot of actual, a more limited number of examples of how cities are starting to try out new ideas. I mean, just a simple thing would be at the airport. So I don't know how this airport operates here in Phoenix, but what an airport can do is just say, if a Lyft or Uber shows up with one passenger in it, then the fee is like $5. If it shows up with 3 passengers, there's no fee. If it shows up with 3 passengers, it also gets preferential curb space. It can park right in front of the terminal. If you only have 1 passenger, then you have to drop off out in the boondocks somewhere. All right? So that's just a little, example, and there's many, many more examples like that. And the messaging, okay, this is from the policymakers and people were, really focused on how does change really happen, is how do you communicate these visions that I'm talking about, this future? So choice, that sounds good. But a way to think about it is what we want to do is create a future where there's less vehicle use, but more passenger travel. So PMT is passenger miles traveled. So we want more passenger miles traveled. We want the elderly people, the disadvantaged people to be able to travel more, but we don't want it, but we want it done in a more sustainable way. So follow the quote of Albert Einstein here. We do need to do things differently. And this is a challenge for cities, it's a challenge for transit operators, it's a challenge for many industries because, as I said, very little has changed in 50 years. And change is difficult and it's disruptive. And so it takes extra effort, to accomplish these changes in a way that's in the public interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Nice.
So thank you, Dan. That was a fantastic presentation on the future of transportation and the revolutions that we are experiencing. So for the remainder of this time, we'll have a moderated discussion with some question and answers with our esteemed speaker. So for those of you in the audience, please do submit your questions via text message to the number provided on the program. And if you're watching via live stream, please comment your questions in the chat through YouTube. And we'll do our best to have our speaker address as many questions as possible. To kick off the discussion, Professor Sperling, we have...
You've become so formal.
Yes, the professor. And we've occasionally talked about this, is the revolutions have been rather slow in terms of their transformative pace in adoption and in actually taking place in the transportation arena. Can you speak to why is the pace so slow? Why is the adoption of electric vehicles after decades of rebates and so on, why is it still so low? Why is automation and all the optimistic forecasts for automated vehicles, why haven't they quite played out as we had hoped or forecasted? Why is pooling not catching on as much as perhaps we would have liked to have seen? Can you give some insights?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature. So I'd say another way of putting it is, given how little change there's been for 50 years, you could say it's fairly impressive that we've had any change. Okay, that's not very satisfying, but
that's good.
It has been slow. Even in California, where we have had all these rebates and policies, and one governor after another says how great electric vehicles are, we have gotten up to 10% market share for new vehicles. So it's not trivial. But almost more than half of that is Tesla. So that's part of the explanation is, Tesla was created as a company, to promote this revolution. It was the revolution. It is the revolution. And the other car companies are these legacy companies that they've been making their money for 100 years on gasoline engines. And for them to transform themselves is a challenge, is difficult. So that's part of it, is the sunk investment, the inertia in the system. But that's kind of so the industry is part of it, and part of it's behavior. It's like, how many people here have an electric car? How many people have an electric car? One. So there you go. And because it is, you worry about, okay, am I going to be able to charge it? What is this electric car anyway? How does it really work? And is it, is it going to last very long? And so on. And so we as individuals are conservative when it comes to, if it's an iPhone or a phone, which is much cheaper, it's not, and it's something new, and it's not as big a cost item, we embrace it much more quickly. But a car is more fundamental to our lifestyle. So, and then you got the institutions, and it's the process of change. I do want to make it, this is engineering. So an important point here is that the engineering is what made a lot of this possible, but the engineering doesn't pull it over the finish line. And it's all the other factors that really determine the success or not.
Very interesting. So my mom always said that we should be very good, otherwise, if we're bad, we'll go to hell. So how do we make sure we do not go to hell, as you described in one possible scenario? What policies or strategies would you recommend for both the consumer side as well as perhaps from the institutional side? What kinds of policies and strategies will tend us towards heaven?
Well, I've got a long list.
Okay.
I'll give you just a few, though. So I'll give you one, just to reemphasize one that I said is making biking and scooters much safer so that people actually feel comfortable using them. If you're 25 and a guy, it's probably okay to go mix in with cars. You think you're going to live forever. But the rest of us who have more of a sense of mortality, we make decisions on our safety and our security. That's one of the grand challenges of the NAE. And so that's an example. So creating safe, secure, and a lot of cities are actually doing this. I just spent some time in Paris, and they're building a lot of safe bike paths. The city of Davis, where I'm from, we have a huge network. The mode share is over 30% of trips are by bicycle in Davis. And it's because it was deliberately over many years, decades, building safe, secure bike paths. And so, and then it's all the incentives and disincentives, I think. So that's for the micro-mobility, and then, transit operators are stuck because they've been doing things a certain way, their funding comes in a certain way. We've got to change the funding formulas so that they have an incentive to work with other private suppliers, and right now they don't. And so that's part of it. And the other is the incentives and disincentives for you and me. Yeah. So like, okay, if you really want to drive that car, that electric car, all by yourself and not use pooled services, we're going to make you pay for it. And we have to phase this in over a long time and different places, but that's basically it. But if you don't, if you're using mobility service, you know what, I gave up my car. I had a hydrogen car. I gave it up last year, and I went carless. And what I learned in that year is I love to be chauffeured. And that's what it is. I'm chauffeured all the time. And I get an hour of my time back every day, because now I can use it, for texting and reading and sleeping or whatever I want to do. So that's a huge cost that we don't even factor in. And it's part of that behavioral. So Ram, you're a behavior expert. We'll talk later about it.
It does come down to a lot of travel behavior and mobility choices. And so I'll present an audience question which kind of dovetails to what you just spoke to. So Tesla seems to be a disruptor for the EV and AV market, but there's still a lot of fear or distrust in the products, perhaps speaking to some of the AV technologies in particular. What needs to happen in our society for the next big wave of acceptance of these technologies? Can you think of perhaps what needs to happen from a societal standpoint for a big wave of acceptance, just as you mentioned the iPhone and so on?
Well, there's all these different pieces of it. So, I talked about the micro-mobility ideas of scooters and bikes. I think with just pooling, creating the incentives and disincentives, the automation is that's the one that's really going to be disruptive. It could be more disruptive or less disruptive, right? If it just replaces our regular car and we just use it the same way, only a lot more, it's less disruptive. It's less disruptive to car companies and everyone else. So it's really a question of how do we get people to be thinking about getting comfortable with automated vehicles, but where they're not owning it. So that's why I'm a big advocate. So Uber, I don't know if here, I haven't used Uber yet here, but in many cities, there's a Uber pool service or a Lyft share service. And that means that if you press the button and you're willing to pick up other people along the way, then you pay less. And they do that only in the big cities because they don't have enough people using it to justify it. And so the other part of it is somehow we need to get people comfortable with the idea of pooling. And a lot of people, I'm sure if I talk to you, you say, no way, never. But my answer to that is everyone has a price. We fly in those airplanes. We get squeezed in this little tiny space. It's really, for hours. It's really uncomfortable and it's often unpleasant. But we do it because there isn't a good alternative. And so here, we can use, I hate to use pricing as the primary policy instrument, but I'll say incentives and disincentives to use, to do pooling and get Uber Pool and Lyft Share, and there's a company Via that's doing this well, help them become more successful, and that'll set the stage for when the automation comes in. Waymo is the global leader on automated technology, and they're right here. Ram promised to take me for a ride in an automated Waymo car tomorrow morning. But they are the global leader, and it's happening right here in Arizona, right here in the Phoenix area. And so I think you all are kind of going to be a test case for guinea pigs to see under what conditions are you comfortable riding in an automated car.
So are you comfortable making a prediction? When will we see widespread presence of shared automated vehicles?
I think so. We're seeing a tiny bit of it. Well, Waymo does not even do that, does it? It only takes a single passenger at a time.
Yeah,
so it doesn't pool.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not quite there yet. But I think within a few years, we will see some amount of these kinds of services. But it is probably going to evolve slowly. So, to get to major market share in a city, realistically, we're talking probably 10, 15 years, okay, I think. But it's going to happen. And I just, as I said, we want to use, we as consumers, behavior, and in terms of our behavior, and policymakers in terms of making policy, want to somehow ease us into that heaven future, like your mother wanted.
So here, an interesting question. You mentioned that engineering can't quite get us over the finish line. So here's an audience question. You mentioned the importance of bringing science to policy. How can engineers get involved in that, or what roles do engineers play in policy?
They should play a large role because, and I'll broaden it to, scientists more generally, or scientists and engineers. They have so much expertise, sometimes in a narrow area, but so much expertise, and policymakers are operating in a situation where they're responsible for so many things. So I'll tell you a little anecdote. So when I got appointed to the California Air Resources Board, I thought this was going to be the easiest job ever. They were actually going to pay me for it. I thought, you know, I've been studying this my whole career. This is going to be a piece of cake. And I got in that job, and I found out that I knew probably 10 or 20% of what I needed to know, because there are all these other factors that determine what's the right thing or best thing to do. There's equity considerations. I had to learn about World Trade Organization, you know, global trading rules, you know, because it affected what fuels are used and where they're imported from. So here are these poor politicians. The mayor of Tempe, I have no idea who the mayor of Tempe is, but Mayor Tempe has to make decisions about education, about health, about water, about traffic. I mean, there's no way in the world that that person can be knowledgeable about so many things. And so they form commissions and boards, you know, advisory commissions and other kinds of boards. And I think all of us should make a serious effort to participate in these. And it benefits us personally because we learn a lot more about how everything works. Whether you're an engineer, you learn much more about, you know, what's the real process for getting a product into the real world. And so I think the answer to that is in people participating much more on all these many advisory boards and commissions that exist in every city, every part of the country, and really participate. And I mean, in a sense, that's democracy, but this isn't in the sense of voting. This is in the sense of bringing knowledge to the policy-making, decision-making process. I mean, if we leave it to the politicians, frankly, we're in big trouble. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the capability. If left to them, they'll just make a political judgment, not based upon what are the benefits and costs.
Very nice.
This is being taped, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
But I'm in Arizona, so I don't have to worry about it as much. I'm going to be crossing the border soon.
You mentioned choice in transportation is important, but providing more choices could also be more expensive, more complex in terms of a transportation ecosystem. How do you know what people want in order to provide the options that will actually be used?
This is an easy one being in a university, we need more research, of course. But, you know, even taking it to the next step, we need more experience, more pilot projects, more small experiments, because all of this is new. And we really don't understand. I mean, Ram and I have been doing transportation research for a long time, but we don't have answers for many of these, you know, just on behavior. Ram, do you know who uses a scooter and why?
Why? Yes,
I mean, even a simple question like that. And more importantly, under what conditions would more people use it? You know, what, in terms of price, in terms of incentives, in terms of safety. And so we really need an open attitude and a willingness to experiment. And we need to, you know, accept failures that are going to happen. And politicians don't like failures, right? So that's part of the challenge, is constructing these in a way that is not threatening.
Let me ask your opinion based on a question here. You talked about the revolutions, but mostly in the context of surface transportation. What is, and that too kind of within metro area transportation. What's your perspectives on some of the other types of new modes people are talking about? Hyperloop for long distance travel, air taxis that'll actually remove vehicles from the surface completely and potentially provide much faster travel?
Okay, so let me do the air taxi one first, because there's billions of dollars of investment going into these small planes that are electric and automated. I mean, some of them are just electric, some of them are just automated, but electric and automated. Billions and billions of dollars, probably in the tens of billions of dollars now. I went to a conference, there was a whole conference of people. They were all mostly engineers, you know, all investing in these and developing these technologies. And I've been really struggling with that one. So that was a good one to call up because I have this, you know, now that I spend some of my time in the policy, political world, and I think about messaging and optics, I think, okay, we're going to have these little planes flying over us with all the rich people, and the rest of us are down here. You know, the optics of it just don't work well. So it's hard for me to imagine that we, as a public, as voters, as, you know, participating in the regulatory processes, are going to be very tolerant of those. You know, we're going to say, well, they make noise when they land near my neighborhood, they might fall out of the sky, they're dangerous. I mean, we do need the scientists and the researchers and the engineers to bring some real data to it. But it is new, so there's not a lot of data. Actually, that's a problem we have in the research world is we always want data, but all these changes are happening and we don't have data for them. We don't have, these scooters are only 2 years, you know, 2 years, 1 year old. Even Uber and Lyft, they've been changing so fast. We don't have a lot of good data. We're just starting to get data on how they're actually used and who uses them and so on. So I'm really torn on that one. I think it's promising because I sure would like to skip all that congestion and zoom over it. I don't know how. So it clearly is going to happen, no doubt. And probably one of the ways it's going to happen is they'll hold just 2 or 3 people because otherwise you need big batteries for all the energy in them. So they'll have 2 or 3 people, but no pilot because it's automated. And you know, these things will go probably 50 to 80 miles range is what the target market that they're looking at to fly across a metropolitan area, for instance, to avoid the traffic congestion. It's like take helicopters there's, you know, rich business people use helicopters in some of the big cities to fly around a little bit. So you can think of that going to another level. So that's the aviation part of it.
Very nice. So in the interest of time, I do want to ask you this last question before we close. So I'm sure you've inspired all of the audience and the listeners with some interesting questions about the future of mobility. So what are some first steps students and others can take to start addressing some of the challenges you spoke of and perhaps to advance a more sustainable transportation ecosystem? What are some steps students and others can take?
Okay, so the things to be thinking about is the pooling idea, are the micro-mobility, you know, the bikes and scooters idea, and the electric vehicles. I think those are the 3 big ideas. And so, you know, so I think, you know, to the extent you can advocate for safer lanes for bikes, to the extent that you can come up with some policies that support pooling. You know, let's just settle with Uber and Lyft and any other companies that might be operating for now as a start. And maybe getting them to work, you know, with the transit operators, getting them to work with the transit operators to provide better service. So okay, so this is taken just one step further, but in terms of, I've become a policy wonk. I love policy because I've come to realize that those of us in the academic world, we come up with lots of brilliant ideas, and even if we're really engaged, you know, we come up with even fairly applied, but the actual policies and decisions to make it happen are full of all kinds of details. And paying attention to those details is so critical. So here's a little policy along those lines. The transit operator. So I don't really know the transit operator here and exactly what the story is, but a transit operator, why couldn't they provide, so first of all, they can give up service in the really low density areas, because right now politically we make buses operate in these areas where there's very little ridership, but we do it because we think we should. And it's very expensive. But instead of take that money and give money to people that use Uber or Lyft for those trips, and either subsidize it directly through Uber and Lyft or through individuals. And maybe to make it politically acceptable, do it only for low-income riders or disadvantaged riders. And that's something a transit operator could do pretty easily if there was a support for it. So that's my last
Outstanding.
idea.
So that's all the time we have for today's event. Thank you for joining us. The next event is on February 25th, so look forward to having all of you join that for the next in this series. Everybody, please join me again in thanking Professor Dan Sperling. Thank you.